Ash, why don't you lead us a bit? We wanted to get you back and talk to you about this national and local, local and national, the issues. Let's go back to Ferguson, Missouri.
Right.
Go ahead, Ash.
Well, I guess that's as good a place to start as any, although, it's unfortunately and not the beginning and unfortunately not the end of the last 7 months or so of high to mid profile cases of police incidents involving mostly unarmed suspects. And from a police perspective, I'm curious to sort of see what you think the biggest issue facing the police right now is. There's a lot of different issues from that we can go a million different ways with this discussion, from over militarization to cameras to differing PRs between government officials and police individuals, and in terms of like what's going on currently in New York between Bill de Blasio and the police union there. So I guess the whichever topic you kind of want to tackle, we can kind of go from there. But it's just to kind of get your perspective on sort of race versus police versus the where we go from here. I mean, hasn't been a very civil 3 months, and those have even trickled down to protests locally. Like that was out at the summit. There was protesting and at the Galleria. So I don't know which one of those topics you want to start with.
Well, it's quite interesting the way you kind of set it up in and of itself. We have to kind of back up and really take a serious view of what exactly is going on in our nation, in our state, and even more specifically in our communities. There is an unrest. There is people who are upset and people who are confused and don't know exactly what to do, how to act, or how to respond. It's interesting, as we begin with Ferguson. Ferguson is one of those situations that happened out in Ferguson, Missouri, that heightened the seriousness of issues that are happening, but how people are responding to it. I mean, we had never heard of, the average person anyway, of a Ferguson before, but we all sought to tie what happened there into our very own communities. In my take, especially in law enforcement, as a law enforcement leader, we first began with relationships and where relationships are. And when I speak relationships, I'm talking across the line, law enforcement with its own community. I'm talking citizens and the racial barriers that are created, the socioeconomic barriers that are created, the have and the have-nots as far as resources and opportunities are concerned. And some people just look for an opportunity, or the opportunity is primed, maybe I should say it that way, where they should act, even though sometimes I'm not sure I agree with the way the actions present themselves. I worried with the Ferguson situation, as I do many. Incidents are going to happen. It's not if they're going to happen, it's when they're going to happen. And when they do happen, are you prepared to deal with them? In that particular situation, you had a young man confronted by an officer that ultimately the young man lost his life. There's been conflicting statements as to what all happened from the genesis of the officers even being present to the time of this person losing his life, but yet it did happen. My issue began when local law enforcement could not readily or was not present, were not ready to diffuse that situation immediately in some kind of way. Those of us who are keeping up with the information realized they had to bring in someone from the state troopers who had grown up in the community to begin some degree of order and diffusion. That's a problem when there's not a ready relation between law enforcement and its citizens.
Well, and that was one of the surprising, I mean, not being there. I mean, it was, if you do some research, it sounded like this was a long brewing kind of, this was sort of a powder keg that was just waiting for an event of this sort. But it was interesting, different than some of these other events, even, not to stir, but even how the John Crawford was handled in New York. It just seemed when Ferguson happened, much to what you're saying is, the pendulum swung so far in one direction in terms of just this weird, we're going to put our boot on this problem and stop it with, not force, but, every night there was tear gas reports and riot gear, marching down the street in line, similar to what you would expect to see, on like a WTO protest or somewhere in Europe, I mean, it was really an odd presence to sort of see, a local law enforcement take even something as unrestful as a situation like this and just continue to add gasoline to a fire.
But Ash, if I could ask just one thought in the middle of this, and I'm really backing up and enjoying this dialogue. If I'm that business owner,
all right,
in Ferguson, and I've invested my life in my business, and thugs have rioted and burned my business and taken my whole holdings away, I welcome those. I welcome any law enforcement that can come in. So I interject that.
You got to be careful with the T word, Bob.
Thug?
Yeah, that's
thugs.
that's the
thugs.
2010 version of the N word.
Yeah,
basically.
but thugs.
That is the.
I'll say it 10 more times, Chief.
That
thugs.
is the.
And
that is the very politically correct.
Black and white.
Ash is correct, though. I mean, there's been a lot of offense to that simply because it's being used interchangeable. I don't know. I haven't sought to put a term.
See, I'm not talking about the community. I'm really not talking about the citizens of that community. I'm talking about the folks who internally and externally came in and had an objective.
They had a hidden agenda, and they did things that did nothing to support, did nothing to even address the issue itself. However, it did happen. And people, one thing that I've learned more and more is that people don't always know how to express their aggression. They have an issue, they're upset, they don't even know who to attack or who to have the issue with, so it just pours out. In my community, out in Bessemer, there were things, we've had situations that have happened also, and you would hear a person say on the streets, well, this is just like Ferguson, and this is a situation where a person is being attacked by the police, and they'd even say it as if it was there was a racial overtone in it. And then I usually will always listen. I want to hear what their anger is or what their statements is. And I said, well, but you do realize that in this particular instance, that all the players are of the same race or whatever the case may be. But what I've been finding as I've started to address not only that situation, the situation that happened in New York, a couple of others, that there's a common theme that is brewing that is trying to pit government, if you will, versus the people. And I think that's an indictment on where we are especially as a government, if we are not taking the opportunity to have a direct relationship with our citizens. Relationships is what diffuses those situations. Relationships is what breaks those things down. If I might, this past weekend, and I haven't shared this with anybody else, so I guess this is to a degree where I can share, is breaking news even on this station. Whereas I've had a young man of the age of nearly 12 who the police in Bessemer got a call that the young man had a gun in a city park, and he was brandishing it. And my officers responded to that to see exactly what was going on. And in doing so, they get there, and this child goes into his waistband, pulls the weapon out, and even points it at the officer. A lot of people don't realize the split-second decision-making that law enforcement has to make. For whatever reasons, and I've learned more and more about it, and I plan on recognizing my officers for their restraint. Because even though one had two officers respond, the other got to a maneuvering position where he got up to the child and finally got on him and knocked the weapon away, which turned out to be a toy.
So it's essentially it's the Tamir Rice situation without the outcome
without the same outcome.
In that situation, the officer pulled up and within about 12 seconds of being on the scene had fired onto what is essentially an unarmed 12-year-old. With an airsoft pistol.
But for the moment,
you don't know.
You don't know. And when this occurred, all of this happened in a matter of just a minute and a half or so, if that long. And some quick decisions were made, and luckily they were able to defuse it. They got the parents involved. We're dealing with the situation. But I applauded my officers for their restraint, but at the same time, I could see where this could have gone somewhere else, because my officers also want to come out, serve their very best, give service to a community that's deserving of the service to maintain order, protection, and safety. But they want to go home to their own families at the end of the day. What we see going on in our community is a direct mirror of what's going on with our law enforcement, with all of the other business leaders. All of law enforcement, they don't come from a special place. They come from the same communities that we do, the same homes, the same situations. We've been affected by the same churches if we go to church. We've been affected by having had tickets written on us, or homes burning down, or drugs in the family, or whatever those other experiences other people go through, and you don't necessarily turn it on and turn it off. The thing that we do different in law enforcement is that we've taken an oath to give the very best we can, the very best we will, and we will uphold the law as it is written. So it makes it a challenge.
Well, and this brings me to another question I had where how it's hard to sort of phrase this because it's kind of a weird topic, but how do you think that sort of this blue line mentality of banding together in terms of situations hurts or helps sort of that opinion, where in Ferguson, I know, especially when everything was boiling over, there was a lot of, I don't want to say tone deaf, but situations where trying to support Darren Wilson, the police came out in very obvious situations where they would stand by what is essentially at that point, an alleged, murderer to some degree, although, it was later not the case, against the people you're trying to sort of quell that unrest. It's a different mentality, and there's a lot of in law enforcement across the board a very unified front of regard. This, you don't know, you haven't been there, you're not sure what it is. you haven't had to make that split second decision that, you were just talked about. But when, I don't want to say the wrong decision, because it wouldn't have been if that situation had gone differently with the information you have, especially if a 911 call comes in and gives you loaded information to the contrary of what it is, you're coming in with, only so much of what you have, you could make somewhat of a wrong decision, and that there's not a lot of recourse, at least lately there seems to be, in terms of the DAs having to prosecute police individuals, but at the same time they've also got to work hand in hand with them to prosecute these other cases. So there's this weird, kind of dichotomy of the police and the enforcement, the DAs having to maintain this wall that kind of puts them at odd with the community. And how do you balance that with what you're saying about trying to bridge that gap?
I think I go back to what your question was. Does it help or does it hurt? And I think it does both. And in many situations, it helps. It helps to know that there are very, very few, a very small population of your community is law enforcement. And there is a bond of brotherhood, if you will, of those of us who wear the uniform. If a law enforcement person loses his or her life, you will see law enforcement come from everywhere, all over the country, and sometimes even from other countries, just to show support. Because we are a bandit brotherhood, we do take an oath that very few are willing to take and will take, and you need to know that you have those persons who support who you are and what you stand for. We all realize that what we go through, that in most cases, common persons don't have a real clue. You don't know how much toxicity I've faced every day, how many babies that we found abused, or how many businesses have been robbed, and how much drugs have been on the street, and whatever the case may be. So there is a bond in knowing that we can all stand together, and we do have a brotherhood. The bad portion is in the fact of when you start to think about to what cost do you holistically support the thin blue line. The thin blue line is thin. In fact, it's thinner than most people would think. By large, most persons who have sworn to take the oath will do their job, will do it to the utmost, and they'll serve and do it with honor and integrity. But there are those who hide behind the shield, who have done things that they should not have done, or have done things and were not held accountable. That hurts. That hurts our profession as a whole. And so we can't afford to ever think that it's us against them, that we are two different bodies. We're all in this together. Law enforcement, the community, the businesses, and all. We're all in this together. And until we realize that we need each other to have a safe community, to have an orderly community, and to provide the type of protection that's needed, we're going to continue to have outcries like we have now. If I can quickly share, I had a public staff meeting this past Thursday, and I have these public meetings where I'll go to a different portion in my community, meet them in their neighborhood at a local church, a local business, anywhere where we can get a room and have people come in. And when we do that, we face those outcries of confusion, those answers that they need done, and we face them head on, because people need to feel like they can touch those who protect them. Until we learn how to do that, we'll suffer.